Hi, and welcome to Heads or Tails, Two Sides of History. I'm Phoebe.
And I'm Sophie. For any newcomers, this is the podcast where Phoebe and I each choose opposing or complementary sides of a topic in history. We research separately and then come together to discuss what we've found. Last week we had a great discussion about communist education programs where Phoebe researched Fidel Castro's education reforms in Cuba, and I talked about the Red Guard in Mao's People's Republic of China. This week we're discussing the mythologization of European colonization in the Americas. I'm talking about the mythologization of the Spanish conquest in South America, and Phoebe is tackling that of English colonization in North America.
I have done so much research, and I'm excited to get started.
What really inspired my research was an article by Olivia Harris titled "The Coming of White People: Reflections on the Mythologization of History in Latin America." In this article, Harris describes the long-perpetuated myth of indigenous people mistaking white Spanish conquistadors for gods. I've always considered my early education to be fairly liberal. I grew up in the liberal bubble of Portland, Oregon, and although I remember learning about Columbus in elementary school, I never had the yearly lesson every November of him sailing the ocean blue in 1492. By the time I was in high school, I had brilliant history teachers who threw out the state standardized syllabi and instead taught about Columbus's genocide and the harm of colonialism. However, despite this, I can still vividly remember looking at painted pictures in textbooks of brown-skinned indigenous people running on beaches seeming impossibly small and unimportant compared to the majestic-looking multi-sailed ships that they pointed at, slack-jawed and awed. I remember captions that explained how the primitive Indians thought of the Spanish sailors with their shiny silver armor and large triple-masted ships as gods. More than anything, I actually remember believing these captions. Even after my pro-Columbus education had ended, and I considered myself well-educated on his atrocities, had watched a documentary about guns, germs, and steel, and regularly scorned the phrase, quote-unquote, discovered America, I still assumed it logical that the indigenous people of America truly thought of Spaniards as gods because of Europeans' quote-unquote superior technology. Although I rationalized this as amoral Europeans taking advantage of indigenous people's trust and lack of knowledge, this was actually me buying into that original mythologization of Columbus's discovery of America. I had viewed indigenous people not as independent individuals with agency, complex societies and intelligence systems, and technological advances that were different from European standards, but instead as the clueless victims of the much more capable and violent Europeans. Harris's article was not the first time I had learned of the mythological aspect of the deitization of conquistadors by natives, but it was the first time I really examined how ingrained that narrative had become, even in my less colonial-centered education. I found it imperative to explore how these myths of Spaniards as gods came to be, and what other common myths of colonization persisted, the truths behind these myths, and the effects of said mythologization. Before I go too in-depth on the mythologization surrounding these conquests, a quick background. I'm going to bring in examples from two empires and their downfalls: the Aztec Empire in Mexico, specifically the fall of the capital city Tenochtitlan to Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortes in the early 1520s, and the Inca Empire in Peru, which fell after conquistador Francisco Pizarro captured and killed the last emperor Atahualpa in the early 1530s. There are a lot of theories about how exactly this myth of Spaniards as gods began, but most trace to Spanish origin, as in Spaniards themselves started and then maintained this myth of being deemed gods by indigenous peoples. Famed conquistador of Mexico, Hernando Cortes, had a chaplain and secretary named Francisco Lopez de Gomara. Gomara, who had never been to the Americas, published an account of Cortes's conquest in which he detailed indigenous fascination with Cortes and they assigned him the label of a god. In fact, Gomara cited a specific myth about the Mesoamerican god Quetzalcoatl, who had, according to legend, left to the east and will return one day, the same way as that Cortes came from the east. So Gomara insinuated not only that Cortes and other Spaniards were seen as gods, but specifically that they were compared to established deities in Mesoamerican culture. By doing this, Spaniards not only established the idea that natives were generally impressed by them, but that indeed Spaniards had a sort of divine right or destiny to be there, and divine right is a concept we'll return to. By inserting themselves into the native narrative and religious culture, Spaniards had not only implied their divine right to be there and established a degrading and paternal sort of relationship with indigenous people, but it also erases indigenous narratives by appropriating them to the Spanish advantage. Furthermore, there is actual evidence to suggest that the legend of Quetzalcoatl's return from the east only existed after the conquest. This creation of indigenous religious myth demonstrates that not only did Spaniards appropriate existing religious or cultural traditions, they were also creating indigenous traditions, which works to both delegitimize their religious and cultural traditions as well as assimilate native people to Spanish narratives of indigeneity. Beyond that, Spaniards often imposed their own ideas of religion and culture upon native societies in order to try and understand them. For example, Andean indigenous people called the white conquistadors viracochas. Viracocha was a word used to describe ancestral deities who had created the current social order in the Andes, but Spaniards saw this name as a name for their Christian god. Similar to the Quetzalcoatl mythology in Mexico, the use of the term Viracocha to refer to Spaniard conquistadors seemed to be a post-conquest phenomenon, further implicating that Spaniards had an influential role to play in creating this conquistadors' gods narrative, equating Viracochas to Judeo-Christian gods and assigning Spaniards' godlike status conforms Mesoamerican societies to Western European ideologies. Indigenous response to this mythology is also compelling to look at. Harris has great and somewhat amusing insights that indicate that not only did indigenous people not see the Spaniards as gods, they often didn't see them as all that important. Harris cites examples of native records kept during the colonial period which detailed chronologically what was happening in Mexico during the time of Spanish arrival and conquest, but never mentions the Spanish presence at all. There are also accounts of Moctezuma, the Tlatoani government leader of Tenochtitlan and the emperor of the Aztec Empire from 1503 until his death during Cortez's conquest in 1520, ordering his men to keep a lookout after Spaniards were first spotted, and then sending scouts to report the number of men back to him. In fact, indigenous people often saw themselves as smarter and more resourceful than the Europeans, at least according to their knowledge systems. Whether indifference or strategic surveillance or outright feelings of superiority, none of these interactions indicate the pious awe that would be inspired by gods. In fact, one of the arguments against the god narrative is the fact that Mesoamericans would likely have treated the conquistadors quite differently if they thought they were gods. The skirmishes in between indigenous peoples and conquistadors and admonishments for massacres by indigenous leaders are unlikely to have happened if there was really a godlike reverence for Spaniards. Harris does mention that indigenous polities might have endorsed the idea of Spaniards as gods in order to gain favor in their own power struggles, but it seems very unlikely that any natives actually equated these oddly dressed, smelly, disease-ridden men with gods. Native alliance with Spaniards, however, was not unheard of. In fact, indigenous Spaniards alliances are one of the major factors that contributed to the conquest over large empires such as the Incas in Peru, or strongly defended and well-populated city-states such as Tenochtitlan in Mexico. Although the myth of Spaniards as gods may be the most fantastical, there are also the prevalent myths that Spanish conquistadors were easily able to overpower these and other Mesoamerican empires due to their supposed technological and strategic superiority. To put into context how absurd this idea of a few guns and horses, meaning a complete overthrow of an empire, is, Francisco Pizarro led less than 200 men against the Inca Empire, which estimates place as having a population of 10 million. In actuality, Spaniards were often outnumbered by their native allies. Even enslaved and emancipated Africans who had been brought over by the conquistadors fought in these wars. This directly contradicts the idea of a few Spaniards being able to easily topple a strong empire. But more than that, it also contradicts many prevalent narratives about indigenous people. It deviates from the idea of them having primitive social structures and military practices that would be so easy to take down with so few men, but it also destroys the idea of the native monolith. Not all indigenous people were working towards the same goals or wanted the same outcomes. These complex systems of pre-Columbian empires meant that smaller governments and or cultural groups paid tribute to larger entities. Tenochtitlan, for example, was made up of a network of capullis, smaller localities that owed tribute and allegiance to the empire. Grievances among rival indigenous leaders meant that Spaniards could easily forge alliances with native groups against the central force they were fighting. Furthermore, even once large parts of empires or prominent indigenous leaders had been defeated by Spaniards and their native allies, it still took decades after initial defeats to actually codify and establish governmental structures. Although it did lead to the downfall of larger empires and the atrocities that followed, Native and African involvement in the Spaniards' wars to take over gives Native people the agency that is often lacking in colonial and pre-colonial narratives. Furthermore, it provides another insight into how these empires fell. They were already destabilized from previous and ongoing grievances with other native groups, often under their control. The lack of cooperation among these native groups helped to establish the environment where Spanish conquistadors could thrive. Of course, the Spanish conquest wasn't solely due to indigenous people allying with the Spaniards. Technological differences between the two groups were also a factor. It's not that Spaniards' armors and weapons didn't also play a significant role, but that the technological divergence between indigenous people and the European colonists did not lead to indigenous awe or wonder. Instead, indigenous people quickly became aware of the technological gap and responded intelligently. The famous book Guns, Germs, and Steels by Jared Diamond explains how the geography, topography, and climate of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East and Europe allowed for crops that were easier to cultivate than in the Americas, which meant sedentary societies developed sooner and they had more time to develop weapons such as guns or catapults now that they weren't living a nomadic lifestyle. However, more than these weapons or armors or having horses, the real advantages that Europeans brought with them were the diseases they carried to the Americas where indigenous people had no immunity. Disease was a key factor in determining social and economic relationships throughout the conquest. Estimates place the Mexican population at 25 million in 1512. It's estimated that the population was less than 2 million by 1580, only 2 or 3 generations later. Peru was not much better, with the population decreasing from 10 million to 1.5 million between 1530 and 1590. This decimation of almost 90% of the Peruvian population and over 90% of the Mexican indigenous population is drastic and devastating. The mythology surrounding these diseases that killed off native populations has less to do with the happening of it. There is definite consensus about this aspect of indigenous mass death, but mythologization instead surrounds the result of it. In fact, the mythologization of the result of all the factors of systemic indigenous mass death and genocide, disease, enslavement, conquest, is one of erasure and desolation. It is often heavily implied in colonial and post-colonial narratives, even critical ones, that indigenous people were either completely defeated and subjugated in every aspect, or to some degree ceased to exist. Although the impact of these mass genocides was no doubt devastating, native peoples by no means disappeared once Spain had colonial control over parts of South America. The 7 Myths of Spanish Colonial Conquest by Matthew Renstall is a book that goes into an in-depth exploration of the colonial myths surrounding the Spanish conquest of South America, ranging from the myths surrounding Columbus's feats of exceptionalism to the idea of Spanish inherent superiority. Renstall also spends a chapter discussing the myth of native desolation. He explains that although indigenous people experienced epidemics, genocides, and immense loss, they still had agency and pursued their local way of life and traditional cultural practices outside of colonial hubs. A decline in population, even one as drastic as happened throughout the 16th century in Mexico and Peru, did not mean a decline in native culture. Renstall also touched on the myth of completion earlier in his chronicle. He explains his issue with the word conquest, as it implies eventual and almost inevitable victory, as well as implies total control, which negates the presence of independent indigenous communities and indigenous resistance long after colonial states have been established. The idea of inevitability was definitely held by the Spaniards, often tied to the idea of, we're finally returning to it, divine right. In many ways, colonial efforts were a missionary enterprise. Even Bartolomé de las Casas, a critic of Spanish colonialism who went on Columbus's second journey to the Americas, wrote that Columbus was chosen by God for, quote, fulfillment of a divine plan, end quote, and acknowledged these atrocities committed by conquistadors, but implied that Columbus wasn't responsible for that sin. Divine right allowed for the total legitimization of all of the conquistadors' actions. It's not to say that there weren't protests against Spanish treatment of indigenous people during the conquest and that those dissenters weren't religious, but divine right could act as the ultimate excuse. Although society has become more secular in the years since the Spanish conquest, the Judeo-Christian values that the time period lived by are still ingrained in our cultural norms and moral ideologies. Although the narrative might have begun as some sort of divine mission to quote-unquote discover America, it evolved into the narrative of Spaniards bringing civilization to the natives, then to the narrative of colonization as a form of oppression due to Spanish superiority. And even now, persistent mythologies that condemn the Spanish conquistadors' actions and are sympathetic towards indigenous experiences often rob native peoples of their agency, portray them as helpless victims, and, at their worst, imply the total erasure of rich and vibrant cultures that are still very much around today. To return to the education I received growing up in Portland, Oregon, which was, by all accounts, anti-colonial and working to deconstruct the pro-Columbian narrative, it still included harmful mythology surrounding Spanish godhood and native victimhood. Obviously, there's a long way to go before education around the European conquest of the Americas is perfect, but I think the next step in reconstructing these educational guides is to focus on indigenous-centered narratives, to look beyond these myths of Spanish viracochas and technological superiority, to ask where those myths come from, what truth lies behind them, and to look at how indigenous societies, remnants of powerful empires that were brutally and systemically wiped out, persisted throughout colonial times, all the way through to today.
Oh my goodness gracious. Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Soph.
Well, thanks, Phoebe.
I am going to be talking a little more about the North American perspective, but totally am relating to this experience of growing up with this very pro-colonizer narrative. But as you'll see as I talk about this, I didn't have a lot of that experience of the more liberal narratives of this. So I'm going to be diving into colonization myths in North America, and more specifically the story of John Smith, Pocahontas, and Powhatan. I was really interested in studying this case in particular, the story that I grew up hearing about that's existed in the national consciousness for some time. It's one of the great stories of American colonization. You know, I was taught the story of the Mayflower and the first Thanksgiving as a kid, and this story was taught right alongside it. We have the brave John Smith coming to the New World, meeting the exotic Pocahontas and all her paint with all the colors of the wind nonsense. They fall in love, but her tribe doesn't approve. She saves him from getting murdered by her father, and he brings her back to England. They get there happily ever after. That's the Disney version. Of course, like many other kids in my generation, I eventually learned that this was, not to be crass, but complete bullshit, that this wasn't how things actually happened, that Pocahontas, in fact, died of some illness across the ocean. But it wasn't really until taking this class that I started to see how much this story does follow that classic hero story, the tale of the white savior, etc. And I wanted to explore this a little more and see just what the true story is here, if there is one. I also wanted to explore the topic of colonial myths in general and the role of myth making in the American national consciousness. So we start here with Captain John Smith, an Englishman born in 1580, coming over to the New World in 1607. He and his crew eventually land and start settling in what they call Jamestown, which would be the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Of course, the indigenous inhabitants of the area were not thrilled by his arrival. We would probably refer to these indigenous peoples today as Algonquin because that's the language they spoke. But at the time, they were considered to be part of the Powhatan people, tribes, empire. There's a lot of terms for it. This group of tribes was, of course, led by Powhatan, the chief of this group of 6 tribes. He was also referred to as Wahun Seneca. Forgive my pronunciation on that. But just to keep things straight, I'm going to refer to the people as the Powhatans and their chief as Wahun Seneca. So after the Brits arrived, the Powhatans attacked their settlement a few times before there were calls for peace. Eventually, about half the men left the settlement to return to England for supplies, leaving Smith in charge. During this time, Jamestown almost starved to death, and those who survived had to resort to cannibalism. The settlement was also founded next to a brackish river, so the men were constantly battling illness. They were really not doing well. Smith and then was captured by the Powhatans in December of 1607 for about a month. He wrote extensively about his experience with the Powhatans. This included his life-threatening experiences with them, and of course about how Pocahontas saved his life. Funnily enough, it wasn't until an account from 1617, about 8 years after he left, that he started telling the story of Pocahontas saving him from death at the hands of her father, because it had garnered public interest in his accounts. So in his general history, Smith writes about this story, quote, "As many as could laid hands on him, dragged him to them, and thereon laid his head, and being ready with their clubs to beat out his brains. Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, when no entreaty could prevail, put his head in her arms, and laid her own down upon his to save him from death." It's a little clunky. This was 1607 after all. This is the famous part of Smith's story that I knew as a little kid. But it's with situations like this that Smith's understanding of the story are actually quite different from what was most likely happening. The ceremony did likely happen, as Smith recalls, but the ceremony and Pocahontas saving Smith were most likely a symbolic part of an Algonquin ritual. Pocahontas was, quote, symbolically saving Smith's life so that he could effectively be reborn into a new world of cultural relationships. Essentially, Wahun Seneca was extending kinship ties, not only to Smith, but also to the rest of the Jamestown colony. The issue here is that Smith couldn't understand this. Or if he did at least understand that this wasn't a hostile environment, he still made an effort to distance and other himself from the Powhatans. In another instance of Smith's misinterpretation of Powhatan tradition, Smith describes a 3-day Powhatan ritual that he interprets as a divination ceremony to determine his intent with the Powhatans. But this was actually most likely a demonstration of the Powhatans redefining their whole world to include the British. Rachel Bryant, in her article about her concept of kinship wrecking, says that Smith was constantly found himself at odds with offers of kinship, like in this ceremony. In fact, in his whole 5 weeks spent with the Powhatans, these were most likely an attempt from Wahun Seneca to basically adopt Smith. To the Powhatans, Jamestown was a liability, a settlement full of starving, sick men on the brink of collapse. So by extending these kinship ties to Smith, by giving the leader of the settlement an olive branch, Wahun Seneca believed that he could turn the English liability into not only a functioning part of this whole, but also into a political asset. And in fact, Bryant argues that Wahun Seneca was seeking to transform and or control what it meant to be an English settler/colonist in Senecamoka, or this area of Virginia. Wahun Seneca believed that Smith could exist within these dual identities, Powhatan and Englishman. And so after this ceremony, Smith was welcomed as a member of the Powhatan community, and Wahun Seneca sent his daughter, Pocahontas, with a party to bring food to Jamestown, which was, again, starving. But in his accounts, Smith portrayed this as an act of love from Pocahontas herself, who, I will note, was 10 years old at the time.
Whoa.
Yeah. And he also hadn't told the other colonists that there had been kin ties extended to all of them. There's really no acknowledgement of this commitment that was made, and that I will note is supposed to be a two-sided affair. In this story with Pocahontas and the whole saving Smith from death narrative, Bryant says that Smith created this settler colonial mythology of an indigenous princess who voluntarily forsakes her birth family for what promises to be a superior way of life among the colonists. But here's where Bryant's article gets really interesting. While we don't know a lot about what the Powhatan systems of kinship looked like, we know that Smith's ideas of kinship were incredibly different. He came from England, where kinship relations were defined by patriarchal authority, a really strict and rigid system that doesn't leave a lot of room for changing ideology or understanding and encompassing different identities. So when he interacted with Wahun Seneca and the Powhatans, he never expected trust, or rather, he expected, in typical settler colonialist ideology, that this would be a relationship he could exploit. Bryant notes that, quote, Smith never had any intention of acting in good faith or on behalf of his new kin. Like, even though his settlement was dying and only survived because of the good faith of the Powhatans, there was no hesitation in turning this into a hero story for Smith. And later, there was no hesitation in the extermination of the Powhatan peoples by the Jamestown colonists and settlers of Virginia. Following conflict, after Smith left Jamestown, colonists proceeded to hunt down Powhatans, poison them under promises of peace, and burn their houses to the ground. In Genocide and the Age of the Nation-State, it's noted that there had been perhaps as many as 100,000 Powhatans on the eve of Virginia colonization, and now it was considered no longer worth the time and expense of tracking them down and killing them, because there were so few of them left. So we have this story that's been in the national consciousness for a really long time, and then the reality, which is that Wahun Seneca and the Powhatans saw Smith in Jamestown really struggling for survival and extending these kinship ties. This is essentially an invitation for Smith to consider a completely new way of thinking, one of mutual respect and support, which is completely incompatible with this British settler colonial ideology. The settler colonial ideology is one that expects essentially infinite resources to be granted to the settlers through the land and everything on it. Of course, through this lens, the olive branch extended by Wahun Seneca is a perfectly exploitable relationship that can only lead to growth for the settlement. It's a very American sentiment at the end of the day. And this rigid patriarchal kinship system that Smith came from certainly created a fear of the other that didn't fit into the simple models of patriarchal authority in proper British society. It's these views that have led us to this glorified colonization myth that still sits so comfortably in American society. It's a myth that validates the colonizer. Colonizers have to believe that they are in the right, and it's this myth that has helped Americans cling to that idea. By asserting that we are the saviors, we put the onus on the indigenous to adapt, assimilate, and accept their position. In her essay, Memory, Erasure, and National Myth, Tricia Logan discusses how colonial myth-making erases indigenous narratives. She brings up this quote that absence or suppression of memories is not merely a lack of acknowledgement of individual or collective experiences, but can also be considered denial of a genocidal crime. So, by validating John Smith's self-mythologizing and misinterpretations of his experiences with indigenous people, what are we leaving out? I would certainly say that Smith's story is a great example of the countless ways that the perspectives of colonizers, literally the perpetrators of genocide, steamroll indigenous stories and perspectives. What would happen if we recognized this event as it truly happened? If we didn't have this Disney movie that perpetuates these horrible stereotypes of Native Americans and creates heroes out of truly evil people? While Logan's article is about Canada's erasure of genocide, I still think this quote is really useful. The role of denying genocide in Canada could also be motivated by an unwillingness for Canada and Canadians to address trends that still exist, or an unwillingness for America and Americans to address trends that still exist. So acknowledging these true Indigenous narratives of Jamestown and John Smith would then be acknowledging the genocide that became of this story, and acknowledging that there is a continuing trend of patriarchal authority systems that center on greed and exploitation in this country, and acknowledging that there are alternative kinship systems that are based on mutual trust and aid, which have never been extended to Indigenous people in this country. But Americanness can't handle that, not all at once at least. So we can work to continue to diversify these perspectives and continue to explore these alternative narratives that can be, as we've seen, really enlightening. And we can start to imagine a different future that isn't so rigid, that relies on good faith and kinship rather than exploitation. Before we continue, a quick word from our sponsors. We all know that this time of year can be stressful with having to prepare for the holidays, especially with supply shortages across the nation. You can avoid all that stress with a subscription to This Day in History magazine. These monthly issues explore what was happening at this time of year in different eras all over the globe. In this issue, you can learn about the Christmas truce of World War I and so much more. Go to thisdayinhistorymagazine.com and use the promo Sophie and Phoebe to get 20% off your first month. Once again, that's Sophie and Phoebe to get 20% off your first month.
Wow, Phoebe, that sounds like a great deal. Now, on to the discussion. Wow, Phoebe, that was amazing.
Thanks, bud.
Yeah, I really appreciated how, we never collaborate on our research. We always do it very separately, but I love how we both started with these narratives that we received as children. Me with Columbus Day and you with Pocahontas. And I thought especially your description of the color of the wind and calling Pocahontas exotic really reminded me of what I wrote about, the paintings and textbooks of, very caricaturized Indigenous people and these, very majestic-looking white ships of the Spaniards, and how similar, even though these are two disparate instances, how similar those experiences we had growing up were.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. We have relied on these colonial myths as the backbone of our society because, as I was saying, these colonial myths do validate everything that we currently value. So of course we're gonna put these ideas on this pedestal that can't really be taken down without some serious shifts in how we think about our world and how we think about how colonization happened, and the fact that like, it was a horrible thing. And of course, like, we've learned that in this class, and that's what this entire class has been about, in a way. But it is kind of alarming to see that, like, or to remind yourself that, like, this is still the status quo. This is the baseline.
Yeah, and I really think your use of the phrase national consciousness just shows how ingrained it is, because it really, and I touched on this a little bit at the end of mine, I was talking about the Judeo-Christian aspects of society that are kind of ingrained, but really the idea of a national consciousness, which there is about, around Thanksgiving, which just recently happened, around the idea of, helping the natives. You talked a lot about that. I thought it was also really interesting about, like, the complex kinship systems and how they kept trying to kind of extend this olive branch of, not even olive branch of peace, more like trying to help these residents in Jamestown, but how, because there was kind of this miscommunication between them, it wasn't really able to happen, but how, despite the fact that, they didn't speak the same languages and they had different bases of knowledge for cultural language, for religious language, how, despite this, it still seems like there would have been a way, if John Smith had approached in good faith, to understand that the indigenous people, the Potawatoms, were coming from good faith, but because, as you discussed, he had this prejudice of who he was and who the natives were, how it wasn't even within his frame of mind that they could be a kinship bond, that they had to be otherized, how all of these attempts failed and led to the genocide of the Potawatomi people.
Yeah, if you read any of his personal accounts of these of what happened with him and the Powhatans, of course it's like the typical, like, describing as, like, savage and things like this, but it's really fascinating how he twists these, like, like, ceremonies that, like I mentioned with his, the ceremony that was redefining the whole Powhatan world to include the British, that he describes in this completely warped sense, and historians have gone back and realized, actually, this is what it was about. It wasn't at all about seeing if Smith and the British were a threat to the society, and only because of that he was allowed to partake in all these other Powhatan traditions. No, this is them really working through their own identity and trying to come to terms with this existence of multiple identities, which again he, like, can't handle. And I'm sure there's mirrors to that in the Spanish example.
Definitely. I mean, what I started thinking of is, let me find my notes. There was an example I was thinking of. Yes, when I was researching about kind of the divine right that I talked about, there was this story where Vaca de Castros, who was a Spanish guy, he was interviewing Incan record keepers called, and excuse my pronunciation, Quibacamayos, and they mentioned how Huayna Capac, that's Atahualpa, he was the last Incan Empire, that's his father, and there's this narrative they wrote down about Huayna Capac, again, excuse my pronunciation, prophesizing that the Spanish would, like, quote, bring turmoil and changes to the land, and it kind of implies this, like, narrative of native fatalism and how, like, prophesizing their own demise. And again, it kind of goes with the idea of preordained conquest and how, like, this was written, this is divine, this is destiny, when it wasn't. It was a series of choices. But again, that is a narrative that, yes, these are Incan record keepers, but it's gone through this Spanish guy's account. And in this article by a man named let me see, I think it's Peter Goes. In this article, he discusses how this is a twisted idea of how the Incans actually would have addressed the problems of Spanish people coming in and interacting with society. I did mention how sometimes they were unaffected by it, or if not unaffected, then didn't feel a great turmoil, because to them it wasn't this insane new thing. They were, similar to when you were talking about how they were readjusting their worldview by doing this ritual to accept Britain in, they weren't seeing them as these dangers or threats. They were seeing them as these people they could help. They were adjusting their worldview to include them, so they became normalized, which kind of happened within the Incan or Mexican systems, where they weren't these great shocks like, oh my god, these gods, these white men. They were a part of society that they adjusted to, which then they were almost betrayed in a sense through these genocides and wars. Another thing I wanted to bring up was, again, let me find my notes on this, because, when you were talking about the settler colonial ideology is one that expects essentially infinite resources to be granted to the settlers through the land and everything on it. It reminded me of, I was reading this article, and it mentioned that natives were not portrayed as individuals, but as a group, a numberless people. It lumped native people in with wildlife and vegetation. Mm-hmm. So this idea that they weren't a society, they were just savages, they were part of the land, this kind of degradation of their humanity, which I think we see a lot of in colonial narratives.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, well, I don't know if you've seen Pocahontas.
A very long time ago.
Yes, but
Colors of the Wind is a song I hear a lot.
Yes, but literally, like, her like princess thing is that she has this little raccoon that she talks to, and she has the mother tree,
which seems like a perverted version of animism, which we learned about earlier in the class. Yes.
But like, of course, it's this like very like colonizer idea of like being close with the earth and like returning to the earth, of like idealizing that while also like not infantilizing, but like saying that it is a lesser culture and these are more primitivizing these ideas. And again, as we've talked about in class, like this idea of putting all these different cultures through a prism and solidifying it into this one idea of what being indigenous is.
The native monolith.
Yes, the native monolith. But yeah, it's like, of course they're gonna have these ideas. I wanted to jump back to this idea of the this like colonial exceptionalism.
Yes.
And of course, like all of this idea of like inevitability of being technologically superior and being superior in every way, despite the fact that literally these people are disease-ridden, they're suffering, they're they're coming to these indigenous people and like trying to pose a threat, but they're like really struggling. I have this quote from Rachel Bryant again that
love her.
That okay, so the people essentially had thought that this colony was a failure, and John Smith was like it was essentially like creating his own narrative, talking about how like amazing he was doing and all of his exploits with the Powhatans, and she talks about the fact that this is probably just like a ploy to make the colony seem like it wasn't dying, and she calls it a popular romance of Euro-Western exceptionalism, which I that term is just like, wow.
Tasty.
Yes.
Yes.
Because again, like you have to insist that even when you're dying, you're literally eating each other because you don't have enough food. You are still
above
the cultural, like the cultural, the pinnacle of culture.
Yes.
That you are perfect, that you are gods, when really you're like dying.
It's true, yeah.
And still somehow finding ways to exploit that, and profiting out of that, which again is incredibly American, so incredibly colonizer. Well,
and especially considering the research I did, considering the fact that a major the two main factors I would say in the Spanish conquest, I don't want to say being successful because it seems like it was positive, but it technically was a successful conquest. They did control large swaths of South America, and they unfortunately like committed atrocities against the indigenous populations, and in doing so literally reduced them by 90%. But in doing so, again, the reason that happened was mostly disease, which again Spaniards had no control over, no Europeans did. It just, biologically these indigenous people did not have immunity to these diseases because they never encountered them before. But also it's because the other largest factor, at least in the South American conquest wars, were alliances with other native groups, especially in the fall of Tenochtitlan. There were so many allies that these Spaniards formed. Like, for example, in Mexico, I'm reading a quote from Alexander Ponson from Monarchy to Empire. This quote on page 25 talks about how in Mexico, for instance, hundreds of thousands of Tlaxcalans, again, sorry for my pronunciation, longtime enemies of the Aztecs, seized the opportunity to ally with the Spanish and were instrumental in the series of battles that led to the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. And then he goes on to describe how from there, many more thousands of indigenous allies, including but not limited to Tlaxcalans, Cholulans, and even defeated Nahua groups from central Mexico, joined the Spanish in their expeditions south and east into Yucatan, Guatemala, Honduras, northwest against the Canskanes and Zacatecas, and later against a diverse confederation of Chichimeca peoples in the region of Bajío. So basically, it wasn't, I mean, I kind of focused on Mexico and Peru, but these native ally ships were used against Tenochtitlan, but then they were used to spread the Spanish Empire farther than that. And furthermore, I didn't really touch on this in my presentation much, but a big thing to note is like the definition of warfare was very different for Spaniards and for Aztecs. So when these groups were allying with Spaniards, it's very hard to think that they were thinking, oh, yes, we're going to take down Tenochtitlan and like eradicate the whole system. They just didn't want to pay taxes anymore. Yeah. They just thought, oh yeah, like we'll disseat the leader, Moctezuma, and then we'll go on with our lives as they've been going. They didn't realize that this was an entire upset of their culture, of their lives, and ultimately of their livelihoods, because many of them were killed by disease or by mass murder. So it's this completely different literacy of what is warfare, what is kinship. You know, we talked about that, like a big miscommunication between indigenous leaders and Spaniards was how to present yourself as a leader. They both could understand that the other was a leader, but the courtship and the rituals that you do to present yourself is very different because they come from different worlds.
Yeah, there's actually, I wanted to say that there's like a direct comparison to be made for North Americans, specifically, at least for this idea of like, of allying to gain power. This happened with the Pequots, which is north of Virginia, where I believe it was the British came in and they were like, we're going to help you guys defeat your enemies. And then they completely eradicated the entire tribe. They burned it to the ground. And these indigenous people were like, that is not what we meant. And like, again, like war, I can't recall exactly which person I was researching said this, but the idea that war and peace were always happening together in indigenous society, and that again, it wasn't about extermination. It was always about just like power or like stability, maintaining stability. But like war and peace could coexist. But again, this settler colonial ideology is just one of extermination, of eradication, that couldn't handle this idea of war and peace coexisting, or and then to your point of these ideas of leadership. There's this whole story I didn't get to mention that in Smith's myth telling of Powhatan or Joaquin Seneca getting the British essentially were giving gifts from the British Empire to the Powhatans and to Joaquin Seneca, and they presented a crown to him and they forced him to kneel to accept it. And so to the British, this was a symbolizing of like this emasculating and like taking all of Powhatan's power in this very symbolic act to show that yes, while he was king, he was still kneeling to them. Versus for the Powhatans, it was just like this. They didn't understand, but they could see that it was not that the British were trying to deliberately degrade them. Yeah. But specifically for the British, it was this emasculating thing. Yeah. And this idea that Powhatan could not, there's this recurring theme of like Powhatan as a father figure, and how taking Pocahontas is this act of emasculation who was 10
when they first met.
Yes, who was 10. And actually she didn't even marry Smith, but she married someone else.
But she die was still young. In England, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that's a whole thing. But basically, this emasculation of Joaquin Seneca And that's like John Smith's goal for a lot of this is just to like humiliate him. Even though like this idea of like fatherhood for the Powhatans wasn't really, it was like when you were someone's father, you were more of like an uncle role, and your uncle was more of your, so like he didn't even understand that. But basically he like his whole goal is like this emasculation and this trying to show him that his system of leadership is the best. And like again with this mirrors in South America, that just not understanding and refusing to understand how these indigenous kinship, how these indigenous just ruling systems functioned.
Yeah, no, and especially I think it goes back to that starting on bad faith thing. To wrap up this conversation, I think I just want to go to the way we both ended ours, again, written completely separately. Yours with an amazing, let me find the last page of yours with this amazing talk about how ingrained these are in modern America, and mine with like an idea about educational systems. And I think that that's really the step forward is what do we do with this research is we look at how we can do better. And I like the quote that I just went wow at is when you wrote, it's a myth that validates the colonizers. Colonizers have to believe they're in the right, and this myth has helped Americans cling to that idea by asserting that we are the saviors. We put the onus on the indigenous to adapt, assimilate, accept their position. Yeah. And I think that not only do we put the onus on them to accept this assimilation, we also put the onus on them to educate us when we do wrong, which I think is something we find in a lot of movements, Black Lives Matter movements, you know, these ideas that like they should educate us. But it's really this idea of like we need to educate ourselves. How do we do that going forward? And how do we do that in a way where we're not moving backwards? We're not educating ourselves in a way that is perpetuating these ingrained ideologies.
Yeah, so I mean, like you say in your thing, it's focusing on these indigenous perspectives. And again, that's I think what we've been trying to enlighten in this class is just focusing on these perspectives and showing like what can this teach us, not only from just knowing the full context of the story, but what can it teach us? Again, like how can we function differently knowing this knowledge of how people have functioned without not without violence, but like without this incredible genocidal way of conducting your your national experiment. And so just to keep exploring this and keep questioning and to keep decolonizing our perspectives, right?
Exactly. I totally agree. Well, I think that was a great discussion, Phoebe. Yeah. I feel like I learned a lot, especially learned a lot about my own topic just by troubleshooting off of you with your topic. Even though mine was more overarching, yours was more specific, I really appreciated that specific insight that I didn't get from mine.
I appreciate the exact opposite of yours.
And that's why we do two sides of history, heads and tails. Okay, so join us next week on Heads or Tails, where Phoebe and I will be discussing narratives on the Vietnam War, or as they call it in Vietnam, the American War. Phoebe, thank you so much. I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Sophie. See you next time.